Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we started a question and answer session, and the question was, does archaeology prove the Bible? Let me do a quick summary of what we said last time as we continue that same subject this time. Of course, the question, does archaeology prove the Bible, is much more complicated than the question seems. Typically, the question refers to, does archaeology prove that the Bible is historically, or for that matter, even scientifically true? And because of the historical issue, we have to realize that even the writing of history is much more complex than it appears. History, of course, one could argue, is a sum total of human experience. But only God knows or could write that history, and obviously no one could ever read it. History, as it is written by historians, is telescoped, summarizing, abbreviated, perspectival, and so forth, which is why so many historians have a different so-called take on historical personages, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Bill Clinton, or events from World War I to the Korean War. There is no such thing as a single history that explains all the issues and tells us simply what actually happened. Now, archaeology, as I mentioned, is the study of material remains left by humans. And any study of archaeology is an effort to correlate the remains, the archaeological remains, with actual written documents, because you have to have written documents to do history. Now, keep in mind that writing is only about 5,000 years ago. It developed almost simultaneously in two river valleys, the Nile River and the confluence of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in Mesopotamia. But before that, all historical claims are even more tenuous because we do not have written documentation written by the people who actually participated in the historical events. History requires writing. It's simply that simple. Now, relative to the Bible, it's fair to say that archaeology, or the study of material remains, tends to confirm or cast doubt on a particular interpretation of the biblical text. All biblical texts are subject to interpretation. There's no way of getting around that. For that matter, and this makes it really difficult, many biblical events, even really major ones, are mentioned only in the Bible. That is to say, that's the only documentation of any kind that we have. For example, the famous stories of the ancestors found in the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, are only found in the Bible. And you might say, well, that's what you would expect because Abraham and Sarah were sort of traveling around. They were not famous yet. They were small clans or small families. The same thing with Isaac and Rebekah, or even for that matter, Jacob. But even in that material, you have the story where Joseph is sold into slavery into Egypt, and because of circumstances, ends up being a kind of prime minister of finance or prime minister of agriculture. He was a big deal in Egypt, according to the story. Of course, the Egyptians, or in any Egyptian records, there is no such mention of Joseph. And so you say, how in the world Can it be that someone like Joseph, who basically saved Egypt, if you read the story, because there was this terrible famine, and Joseph encouraged the Pharaoh to buy land and buy and store foodstuffs through the 7 years of plenty to withstand the 7 years of famine. That's a big deal. It saved Egypt. Not a word. That's the only thing that we have, and that is the story in the Bible. Or even a really huge story like the Exodus from Egypt, where the Israelite slaves are freed and the whole Egyptian army is destroyed in the sea. Even there we have a problem. Number one, that story is only in the Bible. And number two, even when the translations say Red Sea, it's not Red Sea in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's Yam Suf, which means the Sea of Reeds, a body of water which is otherwise unknown to us. There are very important kings in the Bible that are only mentioned in the Bible: Saul, David, Solomon. Now, there are some that are mentioned later on in Assyrian or Babylonian documents, famously, for example, Hezekiah, and even the exile is attested in extra-biblical documents. But that's pretty sparse, and that's a far way from saying that there are these historical records that verify biblical materials. In terms of the archaeological remains, here's the interesting question: what kind of archaeology would quote-unquote prove Abraham and Sarah, or Jacob and Esau, or Isaac and Rebekah? These are stories in which God speaks to people. There are private conversations. Once in a while, I would tell my students, think of any archaeological find that you can imagine and tell me how it would prove, quote unquote, Abraham and Sarah's doing what they are said to have done. And typically they say, well, if you have a document, well, that's the point. The only document we have is the Bible. There is nothing extra biblical that tells you about that. And even in the heydays of William Foxwell Albright and his attempt to demonstrate the general validity of many of these biblical claims, about the best that we could do is to say, for example, that some of the names of the ancestors in Genesis are legitimate second millennium names, which was true. But of course, if it's legitimate in the second millennium, they're also legitimate in the first millennium, in a much later time. And it only demonstrates that the stories have a plausibility, but nothing that would say, well, this shows you that archaeology verifies the Bible. Also, when we talk about how archaeology, quote unquote, proves the Bible, all of this has to do with what we make of the biblical text. How do we construe the biblical text? What is it that the biblical text is trying to tell the people who read it? Primarily, the Bible is religious in nature. It was put together for religious purposes, for theological purposes, for purposes of feeding the people of God, whether they were called Israel or whether they were called synagogue or whether they were called church. These were materials that were going to provide the identity of the people who viewed the material in the Bible as decisive, as authoritative, even as true. Now, keep in mind that the Bible is absolutely related to historical events and to historical people, but it was not primarily designed for that purpose. In other words, the story of Abraham is not there to tell us that this guy Abraham existed, and the story of Sarah is not just to tell us that a woman named Sarah existed. It's rather to tell us that Abraham and Sarah were following the call of God. And a historian cannot deal with something like the call of God. The historian can say that somebody believed that they were called by God, but no historian can say, in fact, God called or God did not call that person. But the Bible's awareness actually suggests how important history is, even though it does history in a very, very different way. Let me give you two examples. In the book of Kings, there are a handful, I think maybe 10 to 12, places where I call them footnotes. And here's what the footnotes are. The book of Kings would tell you about the ins and outs of this particular king. And after the story is told, you get a footnote. And here's what the footnote says. There are many other things that this king did. If you want to know about them, you need to consult the book of the kings of Israel and the book of the kings of Judah. Now, that is a document we no longer have. If it did exist, it means this, at least, that there were many, many things that a particular king did that no biblical author thought was worth recording. So it's not the idea that when you read about this king, this is all that he said or all that he did. There are other sources, but the very fact that you have this 10 to 12 times in Kings tells you that there is historical data, or at least textual data, that the biblical authors did not, for one reason or another, want to include. The same thing about the Gospel of John. And even though this is toward the conclusion of the Gospel of John, it is a fair argument that this is actually a summary of all four Gospels. And this is what this verse says toward the end of John. I think it's chapter 20. Jesus did many other signs that are not recorded in this book. But the ones that are recorded so that you might believe in Jesus and have eternal life in his name. That is to say, the stories of Jesus were designed for religious purposes, not to tell you simply what Jesus did on one fine day. So again, you find evidence from the biblical authors themselves that there are many, many historical data that are simply not included because for one reason or another, they did not fit the purposes of the biblical narrative. So the Bible does have stories about real people and real events, but all of these stories have been greatly theologized, metaphorized, parabolized, made poetic, reduced, expanded, put in different context, and a whole host of other things. That is to say, the purpose of the Bible is such that a quote-unquote mere historical description is not adequate for the purposes for which the Bible was put together. So archaeology is absolutely important, but it is never decisive. In other words, there's no archaeological find that would say, here is what we have to think about Jesus, or here's what we have to think about Israel. Now, I guess if you could get irrefutable proof that Jesus' bones were in an ancient ossuary, that would be quite a blow to Christianity, because that would mean any claim about resurrection would be completely falsified. But until that happens, that's the kind of extreme archaeology that you would need to sort of change the history of the church or the history of Israel. Not only that, archaeology, famously, itself has to be interpreted. There are many, many drawn out disputes. There are heated arguments about how do you date something. whether or not this particular structure is an altar or part of a temple or just a part of an ordinary building. So there's nothing about archaeology that itself avoids interpretation. And so archaeology proves the Bible is in some ways a kind of a red herring question, even though there was a time in which the belief in the archaeology and the fact that it proves the Bible was all but a cottage industry, and is to some extent to some groups who believe that the Bible is history just so. In other words, whatever a person says in the Bible, that's what the person says, or whatever the person did, that's what the person did. My argument is that the Bible itself undercuts that argument, which is why you have two stories of Israel, the one in Samuel and Kings and the one in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And that's why you also have 4 stories of Jesus. There is a kind of coherence among the 4 Gospels, but they are not free of contradictions. My argument is that the contradictions are interesting because very often it's the contradictions or the differences among the Gospels where very important meaning of the biblical material takes place. So, my conclusion is archaeology is important, archaeology is fascinating, archaeology is interesting, archaeological discoveries will continue, and the debate about their significance and their meaning will also continue. And that's exactly the way it should be. Thank you. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and record your email so that I can contact you when we are ready for our mini courses. Just to let you know, I'm in the process of learning how to do this, and they will happen, even though right now I'm starting to feel like this is an eschatological promise. You can look that up if you try to figure out what that means. Also, if you have any other questions for a subsequent Q&A period, you can ask me on my email, fspina, F-S-P-I-N-A, 106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.